Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special presentation from the Emerging Markets Institute at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management, S.C. Johnson College of Business. I am Nicole Beck, and I am an EMI fellow and second-year MBA student who will be returning to the healthcare industry after graduation. Today, we have people joining from all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to each of you. I want to first thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. These are difficult and uncertain times, and we wish you safety and health above all else. Our goal in putting together today's webinar is to better understand the economic and business ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic across various industries and geographies. I want to provide some quick data points regarding emerging economies and volatility. So far, we have seen over $83 billion in capital flight and the subsequent fall of many currencies. In just 2 months, the Brazilian real, the Mexican peso, and the South African rand have fallen 30%, making the dollar-denominated debt very expensive in local currency. In addition, since mid-February, the VIX index has spiked from about 13% to over 57%. These days, some of us may be more consumed with planning our next trip to the grocery store than anything else. While we certainly empathize with that, we want to take this opportunity to step back from our own myopia and look more closely at the world at large. To that end, we've arranged this webinar with industry leaders from around the world to do a live look-in and take their temperature, so to speak. We'll be focusing on the economic implications of COVID-19 so we can better understand not just today's impacts, but also tomorrow's. Finally, when we conclude this webinar, we also hope that through all of the global chaos, we might give everyone here today just a little bit of clarity and maybe even a sense of optimism. The format of today's webinar will be as follows. We have 4 distinguished panelists lined up today, each of whom will speak for about 10 minutes. When they have concluded speaking, we will open it up for Q&A. Please submit your questions using the chat function in Zoom. We will be selecting questions submitted there and there only. At the conclusion of the Q&A, we will be treated to commentary from Lourdes and Gaurav before we wrap up this special EMI webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-organizer, Brittney, who will be introducing the first of our speakers today. Take it away, Brittney.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, my name is Brittney Blackmon. I'm a second-year MBA at Johnson and an Emerging Markets Institute Fellow focused on luxury brand management. Today, Nathan Zhang joins us from Beijing, China. He was born in China and has spent 16 years overseas in Canada and the United States. He has a Master's of Science from Waterloo University in Canada, a Master of Finance from
User disconnected from your channel,
and an MBA from Cornell University. He has worked for IBM, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Citibank, CITIC Securities, and he is currently the general manager for a finance group in Beijing. Welcome, Nathan. Over to you.
Thank you, Brittney. Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan from Beijing, China. It's my honor here to share my personal views about the impact of COVID-19 on Chinese economy. There are 3 main points I'd like to make, which are the Chinese economy has suffered severely from the coronavirus. This situation can be temporary, and the future of Chinese economy
disconnected from your channel
is still promising if this pandemic can be controlled in time. First, let's look at some of the implications of COVID-19 in China in the last 2 to 3 months. Both supply and demand have been suppressed because of the government restricted transportation with a countrywide lockdown since January. People were adapting to the new normal of staying home. Stores, restaurants, and factories were closed, and social events were forbidden. For example, I did not meet any friends in person, nor have my haircut for more than 2 months now. Consumption and manufacturing sectors have been hitting hard. According to the National Statistics Bureau, the gross value of sizable industry output has declined more than 13.5%. The total retail sales of consumer goods as well as investments in the fixed assets dropped by more than 20%. A lot of small to medium-sized companies are facing cash flow issues. The unemployment rate went up to 6.2% in February. China has built up a comprehensive industry chain, benefiting from the rapid growing economy in the past decades. Now, this chain has been disrupted because of the shutdown of manufacturers. Even those that have been granted permissions to resume operations face critical shortage of staff. In addition, China plays an important role in the global industry chain. Therefore, many industries in the world have also been affected. Financial institutions are facing pressure to increase business growth, and risks are becoming more complicated. The Central Bank of China injected liquidity into the market. It has reduced the reserved cash required by the small and medium-sized banks and provided additional capital to help them reduce the pressure. The government has allocated billions of dollars in the financial relief and stimulus aimed at battering the virus. So as a result, the government's fiscal income has been decreased because of the increase in spending and reduction of taxes. Among all the themes to save lives and rescue the economy, the most important one is to stop the spread of the disease. It is more effective than the fiscal and monetary policies. The Chinese government has been able to organize all the resources and personnel from the whole country to help people in Wuhan, the epicenter, in a short amount of time. These unprecedented measures helped contain the virus and brought the world some time to prepare for the worst. For example, the number of masks being produced daily has been increased to about 116 million per day. The government provided extra compensations for the medical workers in the front line. Many well-known companies also promised to give higher priority to the children of medical workers in Hubei when they apply for jobs. The Chinese people all have shown great discipline by staying home for more than 2 months. As of today, the COVID-19 has been under control. Yesterday, there was a zero number of patients increased from the 31 provinces in China, and there were 93 patients imported from overseas, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau. So now people started going back to work, and social life seems to be back to normal. The fundamentals of China's economy are in good shape. Economic data for March has already shown some recovery from February. Unlike the disasters such as 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, COVID-19 is an infectious disease and an outside hit to the economy. So my third point is that the Chinese economy has slowed down in the first quarter, but the outlook is still promising if the pandemic can be controlled in time. So 2020 is the year of the government's 13th plan, and it's the year to reach the moderately prosperous society goal. So although COVID-19 has negative impacts on many businesses, there are still industries that have been doing well. The digital industry have been expanding because of there are more people using digital technology during the lockdown. For example, people work from home using virtual meeting tools. Students use online education systems to study at home instead of going to classrooms. The China Security Committee has also used cloud computing tools to approve the IPO application for the first time in history. So if we look back at 2003 SARS outbreak, so there were actually many internet giants being created, such as Tencent, Jingdong, and Alibaba. There are also opportunities worldwide with many financial assets and companies being sold with discounted prices. There are risks associated, and we need to analyze and proceed with cautions. Investing in these countries can help with some of the economic issues as well. So China has just experienced the first wave of economic shock by coronavirus. However, the COVID-19 has been spreading all over the world now. There's no doubt that the second wave of economic hit is coming. So if the epidemic could be controlled by the end of the second quarter, I guess the Chinese economy would likely grow at a V-shaped growth rate for the year 2020. If COVID-19 continues spreading until and beyond the end of this year, the future will be uncertain. So China has been trying to help other countries in the world by shipping supplies, sending medical teams, and sharing experiences. I strongly believe if all of us working together, we can go through this difficult time. Just as the history told us, all the outbreaks in the past had been defeated. So there's no exception this time. Thank you for listening. Just wish you all well. Now, I guess over to Brittney.
Thank you, Nathan. Sorry for the disruptions. Appreciate your commentary and insights from China. So now, Ashish Goenka is joining us from Mumbai, India. He is the chairman of Swashi's, a leading jewelry company, and heads his family business offices in Dubai and Mumbai. Welcome, Ashish. Over to you.
Thank you. So great to be here in this uncharted and untested times, as I would say. And I think India, one of the leading emerging economies, is a replica of what's happening with the economic implications out here. And I think it was wisely said by many people out here that, the disease and the cure both are real challenges. And the cure, at least as far as we know right now, is social distancing. And we have imposed a countrywide lockdown for the last 10 days. And this will go on till the 14th of April, another 14 days. And we think that, to be very honest, it's a very tough decision that the government took, and not an easy decision. But so far in India, the infection rates have been very controlled, and we have seen the mortality rates also very low. The testing results have been, I would say, positive if I look at it on a relative basis, especially if I compare it to countries like America, Spain, and Italy. The infection rates for people who've been tested has been as low as 3 to 4%. So these are some of the positives that, I would say at the offset, and all of us are looking for positive news. So I think this is clearly an important beginning. Yes, the economic implications are of immense, and I think India has its own peculiarities. One of the key challenges that we have out here is that we have a very high population density. In this entire density, to give you an example, you would have a typical house for people who are more than 20 to 30% of the population. The size of the house would be as high, or the size of the room where they stay would be as high as only 15 square meters. And in this 15 square meters, you would have at least 4 or 5 people staying together. They wouldn't have a washroom facility as an example, and they would have a common share washroom facility in the community. This is clearly a very, very large challenge, especially if you look at social distancing and maintenance of hygiene standards, or maintaining of even, washing your hands with everything that you touch, because there isn't even adequate supply of water. So I think these are peculiar challenges, which, to be very honest, the government has done their best. And I think I really compliment the people who are really, really working hard in the best possible way to live this life, which is a very different life. One of the other things that we have is, which is a very large situation, is that more than 35% of our working population is really a population which lives on daily wages. And these are migrant workers who come to cities where when they come to cities, they're really coming on and working on daily wages and daily sustenance. And what we can see out here is that a large part of their daily livelihood has been lost, and now they're turning back to the villages. So a huge outflux of people from the cities back to the villages. Again, this is another big challenge, because this is something that we would have not envisaged, or the government would have not envisaged when they really imposed the lockdown. The supply chains have all been disrupted. Exports are completely shut. There are no flights. And to be very brutally honest, I think the testing facilities, the medical facilities in India are not the best. We're not as resource friendly, as I would say, as some of the developed economies in the world. So the percentage of ventilators, or the percentage of, even the kits are very, very small if I look at the large population that we have. Another big challenge that we have is essentially our fiscal deficit, which was already high to begin with when we entered the COVID-19. It was as high as 3.5% to 4%. And with all of this, it's a real challenge, and we don't know what the numbers would look like, but it's definitely going to be significantly higher than what we would have anticipated. A lot of this gets funded through foreign money, and essentially a country which is really starved for dollars like us, because the Indian rupee is not a reserve currency. This has another implication and another challenge in the financial world. The way forward, and I think this is my take on it. We will have a recovery. We will have a gradual recovery, and I think there will be a lot of good learnings from this large cloud that is hanging on us. I think social distancing will be a way of life in many facets of life, be it desktop jobs, be it online shopping, or be it even student education, and so on and so forth. This will change a lot of dynamics in various industries, and I think we all will learn how to adapt to this. Another big implication that I would say, which is a positive one, is that sustainability, which was a very big topic for many years, whether it's the climate, or whether it's rising water levels, or whether it's rising pollution, will now hasten, and this would be a catalyst for companies, for organizations, for governments, and for individuals to live the sustainable dream, and importantly, to embrace Mother Nature and love Mother Nature. So that's the good news that I would really like to end this thing. Finally, stay well, stay at home, and all the best. Thank you so much. Over to you, Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. That's very promising and hopeful, and we appreciate that message from India. As a reminder, everyone, you may ask questions in the chat for our Q&A at the end. Now on to our next speaker, Luiz Fernando Furlan joins us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. He has degrees in business administration and chemical engineering. From 1976 to 2002, he was with Sadia in roles including executive vice president and director, investor relations, chairman of the board as well. From 2003 to 2007, he was Minister of Development, Industry, and Foreign Trade for Brazil. At present, he is a member of the board of directors for BRF SA Brazil, Telefónica in Spain, Telefónica Brazil, and he also acted as the chairman of the board of directors for Amazonas Sustainability Foundation from 2008 to 2016. He is a member of the board of management for health for Sao Paulo State and chairman of the board of LIDE, Grupo Líderes Empresarios. Please welcome Luis. On to you, Luis.
Okay, now it's okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this meeting, having these very important inputs from all over the world. And let me say that Brazil, it's a large country. We have a territory similar to continental USA, to have an idea. So much bigger than India, and with a lower population. We have 210 million inhabitants. And so what is happening in Brazil right now is that the government and the state governors, they are taking very severe measures in order to say to people to stay at home. Can you imagine the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, Copacabana, Ipanema, without anybody there? It's incredible. First time in the Brazilian history that happens. So there is a cooperation of the population, and the number of cases in Brazil is growing at the rate of 20% per day. We had yesterday the report from the Minister of Health of 7,000 confirmed cases and 240 people dead. There is a huge concentration of the reporting and the death in the state of São Paulo. And that is due to the infrastructure of São Paulo being the largest state in Brazil with more than 40 million people and the best healthcare infrastructure. Brazil has almost 6,000 cities, municipalities, and 4,000 of these municipalities doesn't have a hospital prepared for, in English, CTI, intensive care, with respirators and everything. So we believe that there is a sub-notification. I'm not sure if this is the case of India, for example, and maybe in China at the beginning, where people just don't go to the hospitals and don't report. We have the same problem in India, that around the big cities like Rio and São Paulo, poor people, that many of them have daily jobs, they are suffering a lot, and they live in communities with almost no infrastructure, no sanitation, some places no water, energy, yes, and of course, TV. So, situation in Brazil is till now under control, and we have to take in consideration that being a tropical country, and now we are beginning fall, so the days here, temperatures are close to 30 degrees. And there is a theory that with these temperatures, the virus is not spreading as it was in the winter time in the northern hemisphere. And in the economic area, real, our currency devaluated 30% from 4 to $1 by the end of December to 5.20 yesterday. And that is not related to fear of the foreign debt. Brazil has, in the past years and nowadays, between $350 and $400 billion foreign reserves. And that will be sufficient to settle the whole international debt of Brazil, not only the state, but also private. But what is happening is that foreign investors that were in the stock market, and they were also gaining profits from the high domestic interest rates, and now they just have flown away. Just to tell you, the inflation in Brazil is around 3.2% a year. And the interest rates, the central bank has decreased it to 3.5%. That is completely abnormal for Brazil. It's the first time in the Brazilian history in more than 500 years that happens. On the other hand, exports keep doing well. The trade surplus last March was $5.7 billion. And that is due mainly to exports of commodities, food products, soya beans, corn, coffee, and all the variety of meats that Brazil is benefiting from the African swine flu that destroyed the production of the pork production in China and other countries around. But also exports of chicken, which is the most affordable protein, are increasing. On the other hand, exports of value-added product are decreasing, mainly due to our neighbors, Argentina and other countries. They are suffering local problems besides of the virus, and they are not buying. And so in real terms, there was a graphic that says that the listed companies in the stock market in Brazil, 70% of the listed companies, they have cash to support all over this year. They are prepared for a long winter time of the economy. At the beginning of the year, Brazil had a forecast of 2% growth of the GDP. Recently, it was announced the new forecast of 0. But nowadays, we are talking about -2 or maybe -4. The good news, we have a record crop this year in Brazil, and that will help the economy. The industry is suffering, and the services, because, as you know, restaurants, industries that are closed, and people staying at home. The supermarkets are selling more, but the wholesalers less, because companies are not buying, restaurants, the food service is not buying, and at the end, we believe that we are in right hands of our Ministry of Health, and like India and some other countries, we have the states where the governors are full of power, and all the Brazilian states that are 27 are doing well in order to control the situation. I'm not pessimist about the future, but of course, in the short term, it's a lot of pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for that message of anticipated growth, and let's just hope it turns around as businesses reopen. So now on to Nell Cady-Kruse, who is joining us from Los Angeles, California. She is an independent director for Barclays US and chairs the board risk committee. She is a former C-suite risk and finance executive with over 30 years of experience in global banking and risk management in the US, Europe, and Asia. Nell headed credit risk, market risk, and operational risk for EMEA, Asia Pacific, and globally, focused most recently on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Prior to serving on the Barclays US board, Nell was the chief risk officer of wholesale banking for Standard Chartered Bank, which is an emerging markets bank focused on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Nell experienced the 2008 crisis while serving as chief risk officer of Asia Pacific for Credit Suisse. She earned her BS as well as her MBA at Cornell. Thank you for being here, Nell. Over to you.
Thank you, Brittney, and thank you, Lourdes, and the whole EMI team for putting this together. And welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. What I will do today is give us a little overview of what's going on across the globe in the financial systems. I will take us on a brief tour of starting with the situation where we are now, and then going through what central banks and governments, the commercial banks, and then the World Bank, IMF, and other multilateral development banks are doing. And this will be a fairly big picture because there are incredible complexities and details behind all of this, as I'm sure you imagine. The first is, as we enter into this crisis, it's very different from any other. The good news is that we enter with stronger banks on the whole across the globe, but especially the large banks, which will be an important part of the overall system. Much better capitalized, thanks to the crisis in 2008, thanks to the Eurozone crisis. Banks have far more capital, far more liquidity, and banks have been undergoing stress tests for the past 4 or 5 years, where they literally have to have enough capital to survive some very, very extreme tests. Now, those scenarios, obviously, no one anticipated this scenario exactly, but the scenarios are severe scenarios. So just as an anecdote, here in the US, the large banks, including Barclays, including the large subsidiaries of foreign banks, had to submit to this, or will be submitting any day now, their results of their stress tests and showing that they have sufficient capital and liquidity. And I believe that most banks, in submitting that, will have sufficient capital and liquidity, even in this crisis, which is frankly, although very different, it's the same sort of problem. Banks need that, they need the capital and the liquidity. There are other things that are helpful going into this crisis, and one is employment. The employment generally has been higher, and the economy's in a generally better shape than when we usually slip into some kind of crisis. So those are the good things. Some of the headwinds have been that in the last decade, emerging markets in particular, but all both companies and consumers have been increasing debt levels. And I think the number is corporate debt, emerging market corporate debt expanded in the past decade 4 times to about $2.3 trillion. And global household debt is about 47 trillion. And in 2008, that number was about 12 trillion. So you can see that households are going in much more indebted. And in the emerging markets, if you look at the statistics, although they are lower as a percent of GDP, they've been growing at a much greater rate, where the sort of debt to household income has been static or down in the more developed countries. That's of course because they were way over indebted prior to 2008. So we do enter this with some very large challenges. What are we doing? The circumstances differ by the emerging market, by country, they're very different. So I'm trying to give you some general pieces of information. Should have turned off Alexa. Okay, the central banks, we'll start there. I think you've heard the phrase over and over and over, do whatever it takes. All of the central banks, the G7, the G20, governments, everyone has said, we will do whatever it takes. Once again, where central banks are coming into this with an advantage is having gone through the crisis in 2008, and some of them having gone through the Eurozone crisis and various other crises along the way. They have built up toolkits and the ability to implement things quickly. One of the biggest challenges is not only do you need as a central bank to have the tools, monetary liquidity, a lot of ways to get money out there quickly, you have to do it fast. And if you can't do it fast, then it's almost, I mean, it loses value every single day you delay. So they say it's only as effective as you can get it out there quickly. So we do know that every country in this situation is going to have to expand the debt. I mean, this is going to be a very, very expensive for the whole globe. And some countries go into this with the ability to do that, and some countries will not. But every country, with a very, very few exceptions, has a central bank. And every central bank is doing pretty similar things, which is immediately lowering interest rates, increasing liquidity by some kind of bond buying, securities buying, pumping liquidity into the system. And that's been happening immediately. You can see that there was coordinated action from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, ECB, Bank of Canada, you name it. There has been, fairly coordinated action, as well as action in every country by every single central bank. There is a great website, by the way, you can go to, I might come to it at the end. The IIF and also the IMF have great data mappers, and you can see by country what each central bank has done from a policy standpoint. And also there's this term we use in banking, macroprudential. Let me describe that because it's relevant in a number of countries. From 2008, banks have built up not only their capital, but they have been required to have a counter-cyclical buffer. The counter-cyclical buffer of capital is something that was thought through and implemented because what normally happens in the commercial banking world is that as soon as we have a stress, the banks now have greater risk on their balance sheet. So they have higher risk-weighted assets, and they will have greater defaults. And as they have greater defaults, they'll have more impairments. So both their numerator and their denominator in terms of capital strength ratios are hit in the wrong way. And so banks would normally have this tendency to pull back lending, but in a stress, that's the opposite of what the economy needs. So finally, regulators and banks got smarter and built in this stress capital buffer. And virtually every central bank or regulator has said to the banking system in their country, please, we're encouraging you and allowing you to go through that capital buffer. In other words, use this ammunition that you've been storing, use the dry powder that you've been storing up over the past decade of good times to help the economy and lend more. So those are sort of the messages from the central banks. The Federal Reserve has a special role because not only is the Federal Reserve the central bank of the United States, but it's also in a way, it's critically important to the globe because that's where the US dollar funding comes from, most of the US dollar liquidity. And so trade, and it's complicated and we've talked about it in various different ways, but the trade and ability for companies and governments to access US dollars is critically important. So you've probably been reading about the US dollar swap lines offered by the Federal Reserve. That has been critically important to this whole emergency. And you'll continue to see more of that. And by the way, on the central bank front, they will keep going, as they've said, whatever it takes. So this is a good thing. And if it were even more coordinated, that might be better, but it has been reasonably well coordinated and very consistent. Next, the commercial bank roles. So I mentioned that the commercial banks do have the capital and the liquidity. The central banks are helping with ensuring that there are flows. Central banks, they are also buying assets, so it actually taking out the assets that people don't want or don't need, and putting out cash. An example of that is that many central banks are buying actual bonds, not just government bonds, but corporate bonds. And they're allowing repos. So, for example, China, instead of having to sell the treasuries they hold in order to get US dollars, they can access the swap line. Okay, banks, back to banks. Commercial banks are, I would call, like the last mile. Commercial banks are really how we get money into the system to companies and individuals. So the banking system, banks are part of the critical infrastructure. So when they came out with what's critical infrastructure in from Nigeria to the US, the government say banking and financial services are critical, and the people who are involved in making sure that funds flow, they have letters which they can carry with them to say, I need to travel because I'm going to work because I need to keep the bank running. And so ensuring liquidity for viable firms is important. The challenge generally is that now there's so much uncertainty. Banks are really the ones who are trying to judge who to lend to. So we've got the message, you've got to lend, you've got to keep supporting the clients and the customers, whether they be retail clients, SMEs, or big corporates. But at the same time, there's so much uncertainty, so much more risk, that you also have to, you shouldn't make bad loans. So this puts a lot of pressure on individual bankers and decision-making tools, as well as the people, just to figure out who's going to be around. We can be gentle with terms, we can extend, we can do a lot of things, but banks aren't in the business of just giving away money and watching it go. So the banks in the emerging markets are going to have an even more challenging time, but that is their job. And I do believe that bankers are rising to the occasion. And unlike the last crisis, I think there are important things that banks and bankers do. And I think that they will rise to this occasion and put money in the right places as much as possible. But they will focus on existing customers, and they will also focus on the creditworthiness of the companies. So I don't know what's going to happen. I'm glad I'm not a cruise line operator. So lastly, let me talk briefly about the World Bank and the IMF and other multilateral development banks. They are actually the big elephants. They are the ones who are very rapidly getting money that can't be paid back necessarily, as well as money on better terms or very extended terms. They're getting money out immediately to countries that need it. It's never going to be enough. There's also a problem with timing, but the World Bank has I think 14 billion right away put out there. We think that the IMF has said recently that the need for emerging market countries is going to be about, I think it's about 2 trillion, north of 2 trillion, 2.3 trillion. And we haven't come up with that, that's a big number, and it doesn't exist in its current form. But the World Bank and the IMF have been very, very active, and you can go and see on their websites what they're doing. But in 2008, somewhere around 40 countries approached the IMF for short-term emergency funds. And just in the last 2 weeks, about 85 countries, so more than double, have approached the IMF for short-term emergency funding. The conservative estimate of the EMF is $2.5 trillion will be needed. The IMF has about $1 trillion of lending capacity, which can be used for emergency financing, some of which can be used very quickly, but not all of it. So some of the existing countries have to already have agreements in place with the IMF. So they're working to have more easy money and more speedy money out there as quickly as possible. The main focus for the World Bank is going to be shoring up the healthcare system. So the very first thing the World Bank does is put money out there to get healthcare systems, hospitals, all of the emergency things necessary in the countries which need it. So that's their number one priority. So they've fast-tracked that 14 billion. They're aiming for about 160 billion. So that's a fairly big number, but when we're talking about needs in the trillions, it's still nowhere near adequate. Then there are various places that the money goes for. There will be money, 2 billion into the real sector, which will be infrastructure, manufacturing, agriculture, services. 2 billion into global trade finance, which is a very, very critical thing for us to get back running in a more appropriate way. Because trade finance has been very halted for both physical reasons, of physical barriers, stopping of transportation, difficulty of trucks getting into countries, all sorts of reasons. But we don't want payment to be one of the reasons that trade can't occur. So that also goes back to dollar ability, because about half of the global trade finance is in US dollars. Working capital solutions, particularly for emerging market banks, and then the global trade liquidity. Lastly, the other multilateral development banks are all very active in working in concert with the World Bank and the IMF, each other and NGOs, and those are, the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, EBRD, et cetera. So that's the general picture of what's been going on in the banking world. It's very, very busy. Banks, in addition, are also, all of these banks, the World Bank, IMF, commercial banks, they're all having to take care of their employees, separate people, figure out how to deal with call centers, and et cetera. So they've got all the same challenges that corporates have in taking care of their employees and their clients, but at the same time, they're a critical piece of the infrastructure. And because they've had several dress rehearsals for this, I think that the banking system is in very good shape to handle whatever comes their way. And it's not going to be easy, but they're there, and it will work. Thank you. Over to you, Brittney.
Thank you so much, Nell, for your comments. Hopefully the global central bank actions, will effectively stimulate global economies and put us all in the best position for recovery. So now I will pass it over to my co-organizer, Matt, who will be moderating the Q&A. Over to you, Matt.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brittney. My name is Matt Douglas. I'm an accelerated MBA student here at Johnson, class of 2020. I serve on the Johnson Student Council as the AMBA chair, and I'm an Emerging Markets Institute fellow. I have a background in hospitality and real estate finance. I spent a summer working in an investment bank in Brazil, and I'll be returning to real estate finance industry post-graduation. As Brittney mentioned, we'll now be moving to the question and answer portion of our program. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it in the chat. We've gotten some really great questions already, so thank you to all those who have participated thus far. The first question is about labor. We saw in the news this morning that another 6.6 million people filed for unemployment here in the United States last week, bringing the two-week total to about 10 million. The question is for China, India, and Brazil. In that order, how has your country managed the unemployment through the pandemic? And let's start with you, Nathan, where it seems China is on the cusp of normalizing, so to speak. How is China managing its labor force?
So as of today, I think in China, except the province of Hubei, which is the epicenter, most of other provinces, people started going back to work. And in Beijing, it depends on the company. for instance, for the state-owned enterprises, so maybe 50% of the workers can go back to work and 50% work from home. And in other areas, I guess maybe in Zhejiang province, maybe there's maybe 90% of the labor force of workers are able to go back to work now. So I think things are really going back to normal. So I think I guess for the next quarter or so, if everything in the rest of the world, I guess, are fine, I think probably the gross GDP of China could be more like a V shape.
And thank you, Nathan, for that. Ashish, India is in a bit of an economic, not an economic, but a national furlough mandated by Modi. So how is India doing?
Yeah, I think it's a very different situation than China because we're probably much behind them. And we're actually in the current lockdown where what is happening is that as private enterprises, we're all asked to pay the labor, correct? And which we all will be doing. But I think if this lasts for longer, then I think it's going to be a real challenge and a drain on the resources of the private enterprises. So, so far, I think everything is okay as far as the labor is concerned. They are getting the wages, but it remains to be seen what happens if this continues. And on the good note, I think India will probably open up, I think, much in the similar trajectory like China gradually. So I don't think, because as I see, the infection rates have not really been that high. And hopefully if this continues, then I think hopefully we'll be out of this slowly but surely. This is what I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. Now to Luiz. Brazil is in a trickier place with governors and Bolsonaro offering seemingly contradictory positions. How's the country handling this?
Well, Bolsonaro is changing, and he made a statement to the nation, not recognizing the whole situation, but much more softer than he was a few days ago, last Sunday, when he went out to talk to people and taste products in the streets in Brazil. So he has changed it. But at the end, the governors, they are united around the measures. And so if you see the city of São Paulo today, it's like a Sunday morning. Nobody around the streets, just a few cars. And it's really a different situation. One point that I would like to raise is that we are all of us, of my generation, and I include among those the members of the Senate of Brazil and some members of the Congress, we are nowadays forced to work with modern tools. You could not imagine how to speed up the process of a Congress meeting, virtual meeting, with voting and approving exceptional measures proposed by the federal government. That is happening in 24 hours, 48 hours. And so the country will be totally different when we overpass this situation. On the other hand, the government has released about $100 billion equivalent to the poor side of the nation. About 13 million families that receives a small allowance every month will receive more money in the next 90 days. Also, they decided to postpone taxes that needs to be charged in the short term. Not only the federal government, but also the states. And that means more money with people that will delay. So the consequence of that is that we'll have an enormous public deficit this year because of these exceptional expenditures. But, you know, by the time you have a situation like we have, it's not the time to teach people how to swim. You need to let them have an aid to survive.
Thank you, Luis. Just looking at the time, we've just crossed 11 a.m. And I apologize, we won't have time for any more questions. I just want to offer a big thank you to our panelists, Nathan Zhang joining us from China, Ashish Goenka from Mumbai, Luiz Fernando Furlan joining us from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Nell Cady-Kruse joining us from Los Angeles. Just quickly, if you have a moment, I'd like to turn the program over for just a minute to Lourdes Casanova, the director of our Emerging Markets Institute, for just to say a few words. So over to you, Lourdes.
Well, thank you all, the speakers. Excellent, positive, and definitely uplifting for all of us. We see that there are ways out. Nell mentioned the multilaterals. We hope also that the OPEC meets again and reaches an agreement of having a reasonable oil price that would help many of the exporting countries. And we also hope that both China and the US continue helping and become, as they are, the biggest economies and the leaders, and can help getting out of this crisis soon. That's what we all help. And most importantly, that the health challenges that we all are facing, and again, good news from emerging markets, because the numbers in Brazil, in India, and other parts of Africa are relatively not too worrying so far. So let's freeze the moment and let's be positive, and we are all in the same boat, and we all will get together out of it. Sorry for the problems, we are learning, and definitely next time will be better, because we'll find a way to stop this Zoom bombing. So thank you all very much. We closed also the webinar at some point, and that's why also the problems were not there as of late. Thank you, Matt, also Brittney and Nicole for organizing this, and definitely Luis, Ashish, Nathan, and Nell. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to suggest a song, "We Will Survive."
Definitely, definitely. All humans are very resourceful, and we'll all survive together all over the world. Thank you very much. We need all of you, all your knowledge and all your strength to come out of this one. Thank you all.
Thank you from my heart.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.